today on the Nourishing You podcast.
So the average cycle of an adult female is about 29 days or so. But often because I think it's because of the birth control pill, I think it kind of puts something in our mind, but we have this idea that it has to be 28 days every single month. And if it's even 32 days, like women will say like, oh, my cycle's so irregular. But when you look at it, it's like 27, it's like 29. So I think that's also helpful to know, like some fluctuation is normal. And do we have an exact reason why you're ovulating on day 15 versus day 18? Sometimes those little things we just have to take as part of just normal fluctuation.
What do you like? Tell me what you like.
There's value in that because it almost gives the brain like a vacation, right?
Holistic health is completely underappreciated, but so critical. Eating whole foods, and the key is just to find something that you really enjoy.
Welcome to the NAMP Nourishing You podcast. I'm Kristen Burkett.
And I'm Diana Wally. We're your hosts for NAMP's podcast dedicated to connecting holistic health enthusiasts with each other to share practical information from the holistic wellness space for enhanced vitality.
Diana and I are master nutrition therapists, board certified in holistic nutrition with private practices and an online joint venture that supports clients and practitioners as they strive to reach their full potential. We're honored to be hosting this podcast for NAMP and connecting our listeners with the latest in holistic wellness.
And if you enjoyed today's show, help us out by commenting below, liking this video, and subscribing to the channel to help us spread the word.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Nourishing You podcast. We're excited to have Lisa Hendrickson-Jack today on the show to talk to us about all things hormones and health. Lisa Hendrickson-Jack is a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner who teaches women to chart their menstrual cycles for natural birth control, conception, and monitoring overall health. In her new book, The Fifth Vital Sign, Lisa debunks the myth that regular ovulation is only important when you want children by recognizing the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. Drawing heavily from the current scientific literature, Lisa presents an evidence-based approach to fertility awareness and menstrual cycle optimization. She hosts the Fertility Friday podcast, a weekly radio show devoted to helping women connect to their fifth vital sign by uncovering the connection between menstrual cycle health, fertility, and overall health. When she's not researching, writing, and interviewing health professionals, you'll find her spending time with her husband and her two sons. Welcome, Lisa. We're so happy to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Lisa, it is so much fun to have you on the show. Our audience is in for a real treat today because for those of you who don't know Lisa, not only is she a hormone wizard, but she's smart and funny and super relatable. And she has the ability to break down complex health and hormone issues into plain English, which I really appreciate.
Well,
and
thanks.
Lisa, Kristen and I had so much fun being interviewed on your wonderful podcast a few years ago. And so we're thrilled to have found a way to circle back and to have you on our show today. So to kick things off, we'd love to hear about your background and how you came into the holistic field, specifically to the underserved community of women's hormone health.
Well, yeah, I mean, my story, so I'm a certified fertility awareness educator. So a lot of what I do is based on helping women to understand the menstrual cycle and how it relates to their overall health. And so how I got into this field is from my very first period, it was painful. I had this personal experience where I went on the pill to try to organize that and make it more manageable. And then what I found over the years as a teenager is, I thought I was fixed. I would come off the pill, but I would still have the painful periods. So by the time I actually needed birth control, I wasn't sexually active when I was first put on it. I was of the opinion that there was something wrong, there was something going on, but I wasn't sure what it was. And so I came off the pill and made the decision that I was going to use a non-hormonal method. I made the decision that I was going to use condoms. And it was right around that time that I discovered fertility awareness. And so, when I learned about fertility awareness, I learned that you're not fertile every single day, that there is a part of your cycle where you can conceive and a part where you can't. And that was great for me because I was able to then use that as a non-hormonal method of birth control. But shortly after I started charting my cycles, one of my charting instructors pointed out to me, she said, your temperatures are too low and your cycles are too long. I think you should go get your thyroid checked out. And that really blew my mind because she had just looked at my cycle chart and identified a health issue that otherwise wouldn't have been identified. It was a kind of a subclinical thing. It wasn't causing me a lot of other, issues. And so that was my entrance into this connection between the menstrual cycle and overall health. And so, fast forward 20 years down the line, one of the main pieces of work that I do is to really share with women this connection between their cycle and their overall health.
That's fascinating. Even though we've talked to you before, I don't think I knew that story about you. So that's really intriguing. And just those subclinical issues can wreak havoc in our bodies that we don't even realize is going on. But I just so appreciate you and how you connect with so many women personally through your podcast and the resources you offer. I always feel like I'm with my best friend when I listen to your podcast.
You're so sweet.
So relatable. And you're talking about a subject that, Diana and I both have teenage daughters. And, no matter how much you try to talk with them, you can try to teach them about this. They get a little bit in sex education class in school, but they're in there with other boys and it's at an age where everybody's afraid to really listen. They're just trying to not be embarrassed and all of that. But it's such an important topic. And I love it that you're making it real for women and teens and helping them connect to themselves on this personal level, because it really is such a reflection there. So as we get started, it's a really big topic that we put out there, hormones and health. I mean, that's really big, but maybe we could start by having you break down how you define hormone health and where you tend to focus on the hormones.
Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, because a lot of my focus is on, the menstrual cycle, and, the title of my book is The Fifth Vital Sign, indicating that the menstrual cycle is a vital sign. So I look at hormones from that perspective, that what is happening in your cycle is a reflection of what's happening in your overall hormone health. So as it relates to women and the menstrual cycle and the reproductive cycle, what we're looking for is a healthy, normal cycle. And I know you mentioned that you have teenage daughters and they're learning something in sex ed class. I can tell you that I don't think I've ever met a woman who felt that her sex ed education was sufficient. I feel like we're taught bare basics and a lot of myths. So in junior high sex ed class, I think we learn a lot of myths. We learn that you can get pregnant any single day of your cycle. And I think we inadvertently learn that that your cycle is only really important when you're trying to conceive. But what we don't learn is what actually happens in the cycle, how to identify when we're fertile and when we're not. And to your question about hormonal health, we don't really learn about this connection between hormonal health and a healthy menstrual cycle. So I think a good place to start is by identifying what a healthy menstrual cycle is. And often when I say that, people think just their period. When I'm asked about that, they kind of think I'm going to talk only about their period. But if we look at the menstrual cycle as a whole, it starts on the first day of your it starts on the first day of your period, but more specifically the first day when you have flow. And then it ends the day before the next one. So if I take you through some of the general characteristics of a healthy cycle lasts anywhere from about 24 to 35 days overall. If we start with the period in a healthy cycle lasts about 3 to 7 days, average about 4 or 5. And during that time, we would expect the bleeding to start, moderate to heavy and gradually taper down and then stop. I always say the period should be like a sentence. It should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then it should be over. And so a few other things about the period, it should be, a red color, whether that's like a brighter red or more like a wine color. It shouldn't be black. And although it's normal to have some clotting, there shouldn't be, overly clotty and things like that. And lastly, although it's very common to experience pain with menstruation, and, many women do, it is helpful to know that pain with menstruation is something that we would, it would fall out of what we would consider optimal. So once the period is done, we would move into that pre-ovulatory phase. And from a fertility awareness standpoint, we're looking at cervical fluid production. So cervical fluid is like that clear, stretchy, raw egg white type fluid, or it can look kind of creamy, lotiony like hand lotion. And so typically after your period is done, you'd have a few days before you start to see that. So we would call those dry days. And then in a healthy cycle, you might see, anywhere from 2 to 7 days of cervical fluid leading up to ovulation. So for the cycle to be healthy, ovulation needs to happen. So we do need to see ovulation. We would expect to see it in line with that cervical fluid happening towards the end. And then once you ovulate, you would expect that cervical fluid to dry up, going back to dry days, and your period to come about 12 to 14 days later. So if we take that back to hormones, what's happening hormonally during that time is that as you're approaching ovulation, what you're observing, the cervical fluid, different changes, that is in relation to your estrogen production. So when you have good, strong follicular development and good, strong hormonal production at that time of the cycle, then that's going to be reflected in the cervical fluid that you see. And it's also going to be reflected in when ovulation is taking place. So again, if a healthy cycle is falling between 24 and 35 days, then we would expect to see that ovulation taking place somewhere between days 10, 20, maybe 22. And so that's something we would be looking for. And then once you ovulate, that's when you start to produce progesterone. And so again, in a healthy cycle, we're going to have a good, strong corpus luteum formation. So after ovulation takes place and the follicle literally bursts open, the egg is released, what you have left over is the corpus luteum. That's how it forms on the ovary. So this is all happening, under the surface. And so again, signs of a healthy, strong ovulation and a good, strong follicular phase would include that second half of the cycle being at least 12 to 14 days. So, some women who might be tracking their cycles might notice that they're getting their periods, maybe 7-8 days after ovulation. That would be a sign of a hormonal issue, a low progesterone issue. We might also see spotting, several days of spotting before the period starts, to happen. We might also see PMS symptoms, whether it be moderate or severe, something more out of the ordinary. And so interestingly enough, from paying attention to the cycle and understanding the different phases of the cycle, keeping track of these different events that are taking place can give us this indirect measure of our hormonal health. And so when we're seeing cycle characteristics that are falling outside of that, general overview of what we would consider to be the normal parameters, that's going to give us a really big sign and clue as to what to look for in terms of hormonal health. So I'll start there to answer your question about hormones.
Yeah. So if you mentioned briefly that hormonal health, period health, a healthy ovulation is really important for women, even if they're not trying to conceive. So can you talk to why that would be important?
Yeah, I love that question because again, so many of us have this idea that it's, your menstrual cycle is only important when you're trying to have children. And for a woman of reproductive age, so, a woman of reproductive age, for whatever reason, we're sold this idea that ovulation is kind of like this cool add-on. And I often teach with analogies. So if I were to use the analogy of a car, if I buy a car, there's all these add-ons I can get, if I chose to get heated seats or if I chose to get air conditioning. I think they all come with air conditioning now, but just, go with it.
Heated steering wheel.
Heated steering wheel. Exactly. Now, whether or not I choose to get the heated steering wheel, it doesn't change the way that the car functions. It doesn't change the way that the engine works because it's a machine. But for whatever reason, we're sold this idea that our ovulatory menstrual cycles are kind of similar to that. But that's not the case. So, ironically, in an adult human female, our menstrual cycle is not this add-on. It's a central part of how our body functions. And so a few examples of that, one example of that would be the case of hypothalamic amenorrhea, HA. And so in a case like that, it's defined generally speaking as going 6 months or more without having a period. So no ovulation, no menstruation. And what causes something like that? HA is associated with undernutrition, overexercise, and stress. So you basically have a situation where somebody is potentially exercising a ton. The stereotypical example would be an Olympic athlete or something like that, and or a person who is, restricting their eating and caloric intake to the point that their body can no longer sustain a menstrual cycle. So, and, to put that into perspective, even if you have no intention of having children in your lifetime, you probably don't want osteoporosis. And when HA is extended for a period of time, it does increase a woman's lifetime risk of osteoporosis. Because, put in layman's terms, this is an example where she's kind of starving and her body is reacting by suspending ovulation, suspending the additional, energy, because it's just not a good time to have a baby, for example, from your body's perspective. So, that gives you an example, because then when we look at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, a vital sign is just your body's, it's a bodily response that we can measure. And the most common vital signs would be like your heart rate, your body temperature, your respiratory rate, your blood pressure, things like that. And we all have the sense that if your, blood pressure was too high or too low, not only does it tell your doctor that there's something wrong, it also gives them a sense of what could be wrong, because we kind of know what could be causing high blood pressure, for example. And so in that same way, when the menstrual cycle is consistently falling outside of those normal parameters, it can tell us something as well. So in the case of HA, it can tell us, okay, well, we need to see what's going on with this woman. Is she eating? Is she resting? Is she exercising? Like, what's going on with her? Another example could be PCOS. And so polycystic ovarian syndrome is characterized by long irregular cycles. So that's one of the possible criteria, where the cycles are 35 days or more. We're seeing maybe fewer than 9 cycles a year, potentially seeing cycles that are varying more than 8 days from cycle to cycle. The other criteria include hyperandrogenism, where you're having a high level of androgens. Maybe she's having unwanted hair, hirsutism, like hair where she doesn't want it, coarse hairs. Maybe she's having acne, and also, cysts on the ovaries. Well, interestingly enough, that condition is associated with insulin resistance, glucose intolerance. It's associated with inflammation. And so again, having these cycles that are outside of that normal criteria could be a sign of a deeper health issue. And, women who experience PCOS have a greater lifetime risk of developing diabetes. So instead of pushing these, kind of health issues under the rug and looking at the menstrual cycle as if it only matters when we're trying to conceive, this gives us an opportunity to really look at how the menstrual cycle can be reflecting back, a picture of our hormonal health and overall health, even regardless of our, current status of trying to conceive or not.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so, when you think about teenage girls and women and things that might be going on in their life, you could easily see how stress from all different sources, internal, external, could totally affect a cycle. How can women begin to be in touch with their hormone health? I think you talk about fertility awareness and menstrual tracking. Can you talk more about how to do that? And it's so critical, because if you don't even know what's going on in your cycle in terms of the timing and how you're feeling during it and the things that are happening or not happening, you have no way to know if it's regular or dysregulated, right? So it's like the first step is to even, number one, say, yes, I have a cycle and I probably should pay attention to it because it can tell me a lot about my body. But being able to understand that throughout the month after month, is another thing, and something I don't think a lot of women really pay attention to. They look at it as more of a inconvenience versus something that is really reflective of their health and their womanhood. So talk to us about tracking and those tools that can help us be more aware.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I typically start by just kind of talking a little bit about, everybody isn't necessarily going to jump into fertility awareness full force and use it as, say, a birth control method or something like that. So what I often say is that although everybody doesn't need to use fertility awareness as like a method of birth control or something like that, it is really helpful that we should all have the opportunity to have what I would call body literacy, which essentially is just this basic understanding of how the cycle works, how it unfolds, how to identify when in the cycle we're fertile, and just that kind of general sense of what's going on between periods kind of thing. So one way to start, I think many women start by, downloading a period tracker app. When I started tracking my cycles, there just wasn't that, it just didn't exist. I graduated in the year 2000 from high school, and, we didn't even have cell phones. Like my first cell phone had a green screen. So at the most basic level, I think tracking when your period is coming so that you have a sense of, even just that. And I know, of course, because I'm teaching my clients a more detailed, nuanced way of tracking all the signs. The main fertile signs that you track when you're using fertility awareness include the cervical fluid, as I had mentioned, the basal body temperature, which is that temperature that you take first thing in the morning before you get out of bed. And you can pay attention also to your cervical position, which is an optional sign. So we can go into the weeds together, if you like to go that far down the rabbit hole. But at the most basic level, you can start by paying attention to your periods. And one thing I should just say, just to put out there, is that if you're on hormonal contraceptives, although you're having bleeding, every 28 days or so, that is not the same as a true menstrual period. In order to have a true menstrual period, you would have to ovulate first. So, you can still, track if you want to, but I would just want to put that out there that if you're really wanting to jump into this kind of natural understanding of how your cycle is working and tracking ovulation, like there has to actually be ovulation. So the type of bleeding that women experience when they're using hormonal contraceptives, we typically refer to as withdrawal bleeding, because it's a bit different to the true menstrual cycle. So that would be kind of the first thing. And the other thing to do, regardless of whether you want to use fertility awareness or not, would be to start paying attention to your cervical fluid. So, and by pay attention, I just mean that, for some women, we might notice that there's a certain time of the month where we feel kind of wetter down there. And I know some women will find, maybe they think, oh my goodness, my period's starting, and they run to the bathroom, but there's no period. So whether it's something like that, whether you notice that as you're walking around throughout the day, there's times when you're feeling a bit more wet, whether you're actually going to the bathroom and as you wipe, you notice that the toilet paper glides and it's really slippery, whether you notice, an increased discharge, if you will, on your underwear. From the very basic of like how to get started, just paying attention to when that's happening. And there's, hundreds of apps now. So there are, apps that just let you track your period, but there's also apps that allow you to put in, your cervical fluid and stuff like that. And so that can be a place to start where you're literally just like, oh, this is what that is. So this is one of the examples too of what we weren't taught in junior high. This is a pretty basic thing that women experience. It doesn't mean, we can talk about the nuances there to know what's normal versus what could be a sign of a problem. But because we're not taught about this perfectly natural cervical fluid that we produce around ovulation, how many women have gone to their doctor thinking that they have an infection because of this quote, discharge. And then how many women have been put on antibiotics and it's not even an infection. So I think that's kind of one of the ways to do it as well. So at the most basic level, in a typical cycle, you're going to make cervical fluid. You're going to see this increase in this fluid as you approach ovulation. And then once ovulation is finished, it typically dries up or at least significantly, declines. So you're seeing significantly less. So at the most basic level, that can be helpful to start to identify that fertile window when you're ovulating, to get a sense of that. And if you get into that and start to deepen into it a little bit more, you can start to predict your period, which can be a very helpful practical tool. Because once you've ovulated, your period does tend to come, in a healthy cycle, 12 to 14 days, but that part of the cycle, the second half, tends to be more stable. So from a very practical standpoint, it can be very helpful just to do that. So I can go in more detail if you like into fertility awareness in particular, but I just wanted to answer that question of like, how do you kind of get started? Like, how do you start paying attention to those things?
No, I think that was really helpful. Do you have a recommendation for an app that you like, a tracking app?
So unfortunately, I feel like you would think I would be the go-to person for all the apps. I don't stay on top of all of them because every other week there's like 16 new ones. Yeah. So for someone who's interested in fertility awareness charting, like if they're really wanting to chart, my general recommendation is to find an app that gives you the option to turn off the prediction settings. A lot of these apps, they're automatically programmed with your, it's going to tell you when you're ovulating. It's going to tell you when your period is, which, in some ways is fine, but it is a modern day version of the rhythm method. So really briefly, the rhythm method is often what people think we're talking about when we talk about fertility, where it's like, oh, are you talking about the rhythm method? And basically the rhythm method is a calendar-based method that's based on calculation. So it's kind of like, okay, well, after you have, let's say, this many cycles, we're going to average it out and we're going to predict your ovulation based on that. So the average woman who wants to use fertility awareness, let's say she wants to use it as a contraceptive, the rhythm method is not going to be effective because all of our, we're not robots. Our cycles are not always the same. And so modern day fertility awareness based methods are using real-time data. Like we're tracking your cervical fluid, we're tracking what's happening, and we're not basing your fertile window on the previous cycles. So with all of that said, if you're really wanting to learn and to get a sense of what's happening, it is helpful to have a device or an app that allows you to turn off that prediction if you want to, so that you can learn just to kind of track what you're seeing, input it, and you determine when you're ovulating. So when I first started, the podcast, one of the apps that was really popular was Kindara. And so, that's certainly an option for people. There's so many, so I'm not doing justice because there's a lot. The app that I tend to recommend to my clients is Read Your Body. So that app is more designed specifically around fertility awareness. So it has a lot of options. It could be potentially overwhelming for someone who just wants to track their period. But I'll, give you those two to start, and then you could always do research to find the other current ones, because I'm sure there's like 100.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Okay. So yeah, I know my daughter uses one. I think your daughter does too.
Yeah.
Both of your
Both
girls
of them,
do.
yeah.
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 And that's been very helpful. And I think, even if, especially like for teenage girls, even if they're not using it every month, just to get them to start using it, and maybe not super consistently, but to just start getting in touch with themselves. I think it's because they relate to apps so much versus those of us that are a little older and maybe, we're not thinking about the apps so much, but I think younger girls really, really like them, but they work all across the board for sure. But so you mentioned some things where, we're trying to see if our cycle is kind of following in a certain way. Well, what are some things that might disrupt the cycle or might interfere? Like you said, we're not robots. We're not going to be the same month to month. What kinds of things can influence that timing of the cycle and might interfere with it being as predictable or normal as we would like it to be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of different things. And I think going back to the description of the cycle, period, mucus, ovulation, and then period. So if we divide the cycle into two halves, basically, then we have the pre-ovulatory phase, and then we have the post-ovulatory phase. So the first thing that's helpful to know is that the pre-ovulatory phase is the most variable part of the cycle. So, when we're looking at what's going to delay ovulation, what's going to change the length of my cycle, it usually has to do with ovulation and, whether or not something is delaying ovulation from happening. So there's a lot of different things. I kind of alluded to the PCOS example where you are having this response, glucose intolerance, insulin resistance, inflammation that's then delaying ovulation. So that's more of a pattern though. So for someone who's dealing with that issue, they're going to be consistently seeing these long irregular cycles. So I think what you're getting at more so is so that's obviously one reason that it can be disrupted, but I think you're getting more so at, what are some of the common reasons that we might see some changes. I think it's also helpful to know that I mentioned the 24 to 35 days kind of range. So the average cycle of an adult female is about 29 days or so. But often because I think it's because of the birth control pill, I think it kind of puts something in our mind, but we have this idea that it has to be 28 days every single month. And if it's even 32 days, like women will say like, oh, my cycle's so irregular. But when you look at it, it's like 27, it's like 29. So I think that's also helpful to know, like some fluctuation is normal. And do we have an exact reason why you're ovulating on day 15 versus day 18? Sometimes those little things we just have to take as part of just normal fluctuation. But specifically, stress is something that can affect the cycle in different ways. And so that could be acute stress, meaning a specific stressor. So for example, you have this horrible commute, you have a terrible boss, you have something that's due this week, you're in school and you've got like this paper and you stay up all night, working on it or whatever. So stress can certainly cause changes to the cycle. So if the acute stressor is happening prior to ovulation, then what you might find possibly is that ovulation is delayed a little bit. So instead of ovulating when you think you would, then it might be a little bit later. For women who are not tracking their cycle, they might be scared, like, oh my goodness, my period is late, air quotes, uh, quote unquote. But what if you're tracking, you would know, oh wait, I ovulated a bit later, so my period is going to be a bit late. So the period's actually on time, but you just weren't aware of that. And so, but I like to distinguish between acute stressors and chronic stressors. And I guess something else I should mention is that if the acute stressor happens so after ovulation, but prior to the period, so in that second half of the cycle, then what you might find is that the second half of the cycle is a bit shorter. So it could cause kind of like that early drop in progesterone that would lead to potentially spotting and or the earlier onset of your period. And then a chronic stressor, that could be something like having chronic inflammation, having gut issues, like having more of a chronic issue that could generally lower that hormone production. So that might be a little bit more subtle, observing some signs of low hormones, like low mucus production or something like that. And stress doesn't have to be bad. Maybe you're getting married. It's a really happy time, but that could still affect the cycle, because of the different stressors. So, I mean, moving on from stress, I would say one of the most common reasons I see for cycle disruptions is around food, around under eating and over exercising, and inadvertent, not intentional, so some of it is just like, we're busy people, you got to get to work, we're skipping breakfast, we're having coffee instead of breakfast. Coffee is not breakfast. So that is huge. That's huge. I really think we underestimate, just how much not getting enough food can affect our cycle. Especially if women are active.
Okay. I was just going to say, shouldn't we be intermittent fasting and on the keto diet and running marathons and taking care of our kids?
Yes.
Yeah, all the things. Yeah.
Yes. All of us, every single one of us, because there's no individual differences, right? So we should all be doing keto. And I mean, I have talked a bit about these different trends and how they differently affect women. And I think that's what we need to look at. In the work that I do, it's not really about my opinions. It's about the menstrual cycle. And so I see certain trends. So, keto, let's jump into that. So, I mean, basically, keto involves a significant shift in your macronutrient ratio, where we're significantly reducing the amount of carbohydrates that we're consuming in favor of consuming protein and high amounts of fat, because there's kind of a limit to how much protein we can consume. And so we have to make up with fat if we're going to do it. And I would say that it's, the average woman, who's learning about it and kind of trying it can inadvertently end up under eating. So not to say keto in itself couldn't work for somebody, but what I would say is that it is quite a commitment and quite a shift. And I don't think it's necessary for all women to do keto to achieve whatever results that they want. So I what I've observed in my practice, like working with women and based on their menstrual cycles, is that yes, there is some room for looking at those macronutrient ratios to make sure we're getting enough protein, maybe adding more fat to support hormone production. But we don't need to necessarily cut out an entire macronutrient group and count the number of blueberries we eat in order to achieve menstrual cycle health. So I think there's a place for keto at certain times for even a period of time, but I don't think that it's something that we would need to, a person would need to be doing for their, on and on for years in order to get the results that they're looking for. In terms of and so again, like just to kind of bring it to close, like the challenge is that because of how much fat you would have to eat, most women end up under eating. And so then we blame keto for the problem, but the problem is that you probably are eating half the fat you need to eat, which is a lot. And it's awkward because we lived in I grew up in the 90s. They told us that that was bad. So this is complicated is what I'm saying. And so intermittent fasting, that's another popular trend. And I often call out, the male influencer space where it's like, all the guys are doing it and we're skipping, just skip breakfast. Like literally they're telling you just skip breakfast and, get that eating window short and all those things. So for an adult human female who is, of that reproductive age who's cycling, What I found to be the best thing is to have 3 meals a day with sufficient protein, fat, and carbohydrates at each meal. What happens when you skip breakfast or you try to eat 2 meals instead of 3 is you would think logically, and you're right, you'd be right to a certain extent that if you skip breakfast, maybe you're going to eat a bigger lunch because you're more hungry. But even I was looking into the research on these trends and looking at the overall caloric consumption for women who skip breakfast. Like, does it make up for it?
Mhm.
And ultimately, even though they may be eating a slightly larger lunch, it's not offsetting. They're not getting equivalent to what they would have had if they were eating 3 meals. So what you end up having is a person who is under eating. And I found this really interesting study that I just keep talking about. I won't stop talking about it because it was showing what I see on the chart. So in the study, it was a caloric restriction study. And so they had the participants, the female participants who were they had menstrual cycles, they were ovulating. They had them consume about 20 to 30% less calories than what they were calculated to need. And the experimental group was exercising as well. So they were exercising and purposely consuming 20 to 30% less calories versus the control group who was not really exercising and was eating a eucaloric diet. So they were eating sufficient calories. And they measured, they were looking at the menstrual cycle and they measured the hormones. They measured estrogen and progesterone. And so basically what happened was that the women who were eating the lower calorie diet, they still remained ovulatory. So their cycles didn't stop. And there wasn't even a huge shift in the luteal phase length. But the actual hormone production, the estrogen and progesterone, was significantly lower. And this is often what I see in the cycles where we're like, why am I not seeing any cervical mucus? Or why do I have all this weird PMS symptoms, And because we don't really realize, like, this is like I call them the foundational factors with my clients, but literally, like, this is the foundation that you're building your house on. If you don't eat enough protein, I sound like someone's grandma, like, if you don't eat enough protein, but if you don't eat enough protein, if you don't get enough fat, if you don't get enough, carbohydrate, like if you don't eat enough food, basically, to support hormone production, then your body can't do it as efficiently. It just doesn't happen. So that's a big tangent, right? But in a way it's not, because this is one of the things that I see as being the most significant for cycle disruptions. So whether it's just that it's a general pattern, maybe ovulation is delayed sometimes, maybe we're seeing a shorter luteal phase the second half of the cycle, maybe we're seeing some of that spotting, etc. Or whether it's more severe and you actually have a client who is fully, ovulating more sporadically or potentially loses her cycle. So there's other issues as well. There's different medical issues or different conditions. Like if a person has significant food sensitivities, they might notice abnormal cervical mucus patterns. There are other kind of basic things, like if you have a yeast infection, you might notice some level of cervical mucus every single day. It looks like cervical fluid, but it's, cottage cheesy, TMI. But you might notice something like that. So there's other patterns you could pick up, but I would say that's a good place to start for cycle disruptions. Or maybe you could, ask me a couple other questions if I missed something important, but that's where my mind goes to for sure.
Well, and I'm thinking there's probably a couple different mechanisms at play with the whole calorie restriction thing. Is number one, just having enough nutrients to make those hormones. But then number two, it's a stressor to the body, right? Because the body thinks it's starving. It thinks and it's not a safe place to reproduce. So even if you're not wanting to reproduce right now, you're not wanting to get pregnant, your body doesn't know where your head is on getting pregnant. Your body wants, it's going to produce hormones when it feels safe enough to reproduce. And so if you're not providing it enough calories, it doesn't feel safe. It feels like it has to protect itself. So I think there might be a couple of different things at play there that affect that. But, I think people feel like, well, I'm not trying to get pregnant, so it doesn't matter. But the body, it's its own thing going on in the background with, I'm going to be as healthy as I can be and reproduce at any point in time when I feel safe to do it. Whether or not you want to get pregnant or not is not the issue. But yeah.
Well, and there's other symptoms that can crop up, So if you're, for example, in that example where you're not getting enough overall calories, for example, often, not always, because people are different, right? But often you're having someone who's also feeling kind of tired, maybe having a hard time getting out of bed, maybe having a hard time sleeping, maybe having these like really ridiculous PMS symptoms. And so, even if you're not trying to conceive, having imbalanced hormones throughout the menstrual cycle can cause other potential issues that are uncomfortable and not great. So I think that's also important to kind of point out, because you still want to feel good. You still want to be strong. You still want to have energy. You still want to, feel emotionally consistent and not like up and down. So there's a lot of benefit to balancing hormones, even if it's not for the purpose of planning ahead to conceive.
I have one more question, just going back to intermittent fasting for a moment, because I believe it's the number one diet, most popular diet in the US today. I know I get a million questions. I'm sure Kristen, same, and Lisa. So is it different looking at intermittent fasting for someone who is cycling and of reproductive age versus a woman who is in menopause?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I tend to think that we need to eat enough food.
Okay. Just women, no matter what
yeah.
the age, no matter. Okay.
But with that said, because when in menopause, you don't have the cycle. So
Right,
you don't have the kind of the warning sign. So I will admit that I am a little bit biased on this topic.
Okay.
Again, because there is a tendency for women to undereat. So, let me give an example. So when you think of men who are trying to work out, what are their goals? Stereotypically, obviously, not every man is the same.
Get bigger.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes. So they're going to build muscle, right? They're trying to. So generally speaking, men eat more when they exercise. Like if they're going to lift, they're going to eat more. They're eating more protein. Maybe they're having the next meal. They're eating more steak. Stereotypically, of course,
Yes.
because they're trying to get bigger. But what women's goals typically, we're trying to slim up, we're trying to lose weight, or we're trying to lean up, or whatever. And so there's this thing that happens very consistently with women where we really do undereat protein. This is something that I've just seen so consistently, and ironically as well, often women who are intermittent fasting are also working out a lot.
Yes.
And so because it like goes together because we're very health conscious. So what happens is you're working out more, but as a woman, it doesn't seem to come natural to think, okay, because I'm working out, I should have an additional meal, or I should eat more protein today, that kind of thing. And so my issue is kind of less the fat, like it's the consequence of the fasting, because ultimately what you have in the end is a person who in the course of a 24-hour period is eating less food. So, I mean, again, intermittent fasting, there's different ways to do it. I was doing research and I learned there's all these different ways to do it, right? There's the eating window, like 23-1 versus, like all the, so when you're looking at it, if I'm speaking to a client who wants to intermittent fast, I'm the annoying person that's going to suggest that why don't we have that eating window be at least 8 to 10 hours in that day? And if you want to do intermittent fasting, have you considered eating 3 meals a day without snacks and making sure those are really, really full meals? Again, I tend to stray a little bit away from that because, again, the biggest thing I find with my active clients is that they're under eating. So I'll give you a couple of examples just to kind of bring it home. So typically speaking, now this is a generalization, but my recommendation for adult women in general is that we probably need to see at least 80 to 100 grams of protein a day. And I usually just call out protein because that's what we're under eating. I don't need to tell anyone to eat more carbs, but that's not necessarily true, depending, right? Like you could have a client where you do have to have that conversation. So I don't want to generalize, but let's just stick with protein for now. And so when you're active, that depending on your level of activity and things like that might have to increase to 120 to 150. And I've worked with plenty of clients who maybe they're, for whatever reason, whether it's that they're skipping meals, whether it's that they're busy, whether it's that they're really minimizing how much meat they're eating, they're getting like 40 to 50 grams a day of protein, and their luteal phase is 7 days, and they've got all this PMS, and it's like, right? So I wouldn't put a broad generalization, but even for the woman in menopause, if she's intermittent fasting, again, is she also exercising? She still needs protein. And a lot of women, especially before their last period, so while they're in that pre-menopause stage, I've worked with I worked with several clients, a couple in the last year specifically, who were experiencing extreme premenopause symptoms, bleeding that wouldn't stop for like a month or 4 months, active, doing their thing, getting no protein. And the protein was able to help stabilize some of those symptoms. So unfortunately, I'm a little bit biased on this topic. I would never say like, don't ever do it. But I would say if you're an active person and you're wanting to do it, why don't you just check how much you're eating to make sure that you're getting enough overall calories to support your activity level? It's really important.
No, thank you. Thank you for saying that. And I think how it's so important to our protein requirement increases as we age, which a lot of people don't know. And then of course, falls, a death from falls or injury from falls as we get older is one of the leading causes of death. So maintaining muscle mass by consuming enough protein, enough calories. So thank you. I'm biased in the same way.
Yeah, I'll third that because it's been a consistent theme, especially I'll just say in the last several weeks with my clients and doing just basic diet analysis. The amount of protein on an average day is just way below what we're all talking about here. And I don't know what's gotten us away from that. I think you mentioned, several different potential reasons, Lisa, but
I can think of one I should just call. I feel like there's definitely a trend. Now, correct me if I'm wrong or if you have seen something different, but I feel like there's definitely a trend away from like animal protein, right? Like, so there's this idea that the most healthy way to eat involves as little meat as possible. And I mean, at the end of the day, that I feel like in theory, theoretically, it could work. But what I see in practice is that even my clients that eat meat, they still tend to undereat protein. So when we remove the meat, it's hard. It's like you have to, if you're getting enough protein on a diet that doesn't include meat or includes very little, you are making an active effort to do that. You know what I mean? And so unless it's a priority for you and you're minimizing the meat, for example, I encourage my clients to track, like I don't like to encourage what's it called, like the behavior of like monitor everything, but I do encourage them to track at least like a couple days so that we get a sense of what's going on. And it's incredible what you can learn by doing that. So that's not the only reason, but I think it's a big reason because there's a lot of health conscious people, like the people who are doing the intermittent fasting and doing the exercise. We're health conscious. We're trying to stay healthy. We're trying to stay fit. We're trying to stay lean. We're trying to maintain that body weight, all of those things. And so then we're trying to gravitate to the healthiest possible way to eat, which the media is telling us is like no meat. And unfortunately for many of us, it literally just doesn't work with the menstrual. And the menstrual cycle is my barometer. It's my gauge. It's the vital sign that I'm looking at. And so the way to tell if what you're doing is working is to look at the cycle and see what's going on there.
Yeah. So I know we're getting towards the end of the time, but there's one other question I'm just dying to ask you because I tend to find that for women who are ready to get pregnant or want to get pregnant, once they make that decision, that's it. Like there's no stopping it, right? Like you're on the track and you're not gonna back down from it. How soon before someone wants to get pregnant is it important to understand the cycle and bring these different factors together? The stress, the diet, the sleep, all of the things that influence the cycle. How long should a woman be thinking about this before she's like ready to flip the switch?
Well, I mean, in terms of thinking about it, I mean, in a perfect world, we would be thinking about it in a long time. We would be encouraged to learn about our cycle from when we were in junior high. So at least be on our radar. In a more practical sense, I think, so for someone who's on contraceptives, I often talk about, that specific scenario. That's a whole other conversation, but the short version of it would be that if you're on a hormonal contraceptive, something that is suppressing your ovulation, then when you're ready to conceive it, in my experience and what the research would suggest is that there is this a temporary period of subfertility. So it does make sense to really consider incorporating a transition period into your plans so that you're planning to come off of those contraceptives, anywhere from 6 months to a year before you're ready to start to conceive. And that would mean that you would have to, switch and, use a non-hormonal barrier type method of birth control for a period of time. So that would be one scenario where I would say, that would make a lot of sense. To answer your question about, paying attention to the cycle and looking at the different parameters and things like that, ideally we would want to see, in a perfect world, we have all the time in the world and a minimum of, 3 full cycles, so ovulation period 3 times, where your cycle's largely falling into those parameters that I shared. So your period's normal, you've got normal mucus production before ovulation, you are ovulating, your luteal phase, so the second half of the cycle, is long enough, and your cycle is falling within that 24 to 35 day range regularly. So that from a cycle perspective, from a hormone perspective, that would be ideal. From the preconception nutrition perspective, I would recommend to really consider implementing a plan for a minimum of 6 months, if you're able to, 6 to 12 months before you're ready to start trying to conceive, where you're implementing and specifically incorporating certain foods to really build up those nutrients. The analogy that I often use with my clients is the bank account analogy. So when you're preparing for pregnancy, you have the opportunity to fill that bank account. But once you are pregnant and you then, have said baby and you begin breastfeeding, all that happens in that period of time is withdrawals. When you're growing a human being, that's a very nutrient dependent process. And there's arguably no other time in your life where you're going to require as much nutrition as when you're growing another human. And then when you go into the breastfeeding phase, then, your baby is literally sucking the nutrients out of your body. And so in my experience, a lot of my clients postpartum are depleted. If they're doing nutrient panels, they're getting their nutrients checked, hormonal profiles, often this is a time when we are really deficient in things like iron and B12, folate and vitamin A and iodine and vitamin D. And so if at all possible, I think that period of time, 6 to 12 months before you're ready to conceive, get your partner on board too, because he's half of the equation, and really focus on nutrition for that time.
Great.
Good.
That's awesome. Well, you're singing our song.
We're on the same
we
way.
talk about all the time, and we could go on all day. It's just been so great to talk to you about this topic. And, Diana and I have been diving into the hormone world for a long time with our clients and our practice, and love to hear the work that you're doing and love your book. Thank you for getting that out there. I think hopefully our audience will pick that up, The Fifth Vital Sign. Be a great reference and to incorporate these principles and that type of thing. So thanks for taking the time to catch up with us today.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for having me. You asked great questions, and always a topic I love to talk about. Mm-hmm. And I'm excited for the two of you for your show. So thank you for letting me be part of it.
Thank you. Can you tell us real quick where everyone can find you?
Yes. So if you liked what we talked about today, my podcast is the Fertility Friday podcast. So you can type in Fertility Friday in your favorite podcast player and find me. We're in the 8th year. So I've been talking about vaginas for a very long time, and hormones, of course. And so if, in terms of the conversation we had around fertility awareness and things like that, we, take a lot of deep dives into that over there. The book is The Fifth Vital Sign. You can get that on Amazon. You can get the first chapter at thefifthvitalsignbook.com. And I'm also on Instagram. So there's lots of interesting, fun posts happening over there at Fertility Friday.
Excellent. Well, thank you again so much. It's always fun to connect with you. So we'll have to do it again. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Take care.
If you'd like to access other episodes or subscribe so you don't miss a beat, you can find us at nanp.org/NANP-podcast.
Membership in the NANP provides you with a competitive advantage. Whether you're a current practitioner or a student, we want you to become an active, informed leader of the holistic nutrition community and join today at nanp.org. NANP is very proud to provide the highest level of professional recognition and validation in the holistic nutrition industry through the board certification in holistic nutrition credential. To earn this valuable designation, candidates must demonstrate an exceptional level of knowledge and understanding of holistic nutrition by passing a board exam and documenting client contact hours. Are you ready to boost your credibility with board certification? Visit NAMP.org today to apply.
Keep in mind that the information on the NAMP podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical or legal advice. The NAMP is not liable or responsible for any harm, damage, or illness arising from the use of the information contained herein. By listening to the information on this podcast, you agree to defend, indemnify, and hold harmless the NAMP and all agents. Copyright NAMP, all rights reserved.